Everything that gave us rest is crumbling, and we realize that we were made for more.
All those secular narratives that fascism, communism, liberal democracy, technology, they're going to save us. Nobody believes that anymore.
People are looking for something other than the secular, scientific, materialistic world. And this is the moment for us to be comfortable in our own skin and say, this is who we are.
Twin Towers, those planes crashing into it, made people realize that, for better or worse, religion was still a powerful motivation for people.
If we're gaining strength but losing political power, will we notice what God is doing?
Western liberal democracy, well, Brexit, Donald Trump. That kind of raised questions about all that.
What on earth is going on with Christianity at the moment?
Great delight to be hosting this recording live of the Re-Enchanting podcast. This is the final in their 7th series, and they discuss fascinating issues around politics, science, culture, arts, but always looking at how these areas of our life together can be and are being re-enchanted by the good news of the gospel. Hosted, as I'm sure you know, by Bishop Graham Tomlin, by Dr. Belle Tindall, and by the one and only gazillion streaming podcaster and best-selling author Justin Brierley. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great delight to welcome to the Wildfires Festival. This is the Re-Enchanting podcast.
That is the best opener to a re-enchanting episode we have ever had.
We should get that guy on our PR, shouldn't we?
Yes.
Yeah.
I want every episode to start that way. Okay. For those
who is
not
Yeah, who was that guy? Anyone know?
For those not in the room, for those listening, welcome to the Re-Enchanting podcast. I am, as usual, your host, Belle Tindall.
And I'm Justin Brierley.
Yes, and we are in a very special place, gearing up to have a very special conversation. We are recording live from Wildfires Festival, which means that we are in the company of a live audience.
Whoa.
Yes, for our final episode, our finale of season 7. And we also have the company, once again, we can't get enough of him, of Bishop Graham Tomlin, editor-in-chief of Seen and Unseen, alongside many other things. Hello.
Hello, Belle. Hello, Justin. Hello, everybody.
Yeah. So Graham, Justin, and I, we're going to do something a little bit different today. We each, from our own perspectives, from our own angles, we spend so much of our professional lives, and because actually we're pretty nerdy about this stuff, a lot of our personal lives too, trying to read the cultural happenings, right? Trying to acquaint ourselves with the cultural moment. We try and read it, we try and understand it, mull it over, and so hopefully we can go about responding to it. And that is exactly what we're going to do today. That is our one and our only agenda. We, us three, are going to try and read this incredibly exciting cultural moment, and we are using Bible Society's Quiet Revival data as a launch pad through which to do that. So that is what we're going to do for the next hour. The Quiet Revival. Let's start there, shall we? And then we'll move on. Okay, so I'm just going to read the headlines for the Quiet Revival, which was a piece of research done by Bible Society in collaboration with YouGov. And this is just the headlines, okay? You can find this online and you can dig deep and mull it over and pray it over. I recommend you do. But the headline is that church decline in England and Wales has not only stopped, but the church is growing as Gen Z leans an exciting turnaround in church attendance. It has risen by 50% over the last 6 years, busting the myth of church decline. That's a pretty great headline, isn't it? So Graham and Justin, let's just start. Graham, I'll start with you. Tell me your thoughts on those findings.
Well, they came as in some ways, a bit of a surprise to everybody, and there's a sign that something is stirring, something quite remarkable is happening, and I've been trying to sort of work out what that is, and it struck me that at the same time as this research came out, there were a couple of other surveys that came out which had some very interesting kind of parallel findings. One was a survey that was done by the Pew Research Group that said that it's always a different sort of finding. It said that I think something like 36% of people in the UK who had sort of ticked the box Christian, especially amongst the sort of Gen Z kind of demographic, were now exploring other paths than Christianity. So that was one sort of survey, which is saying something different. People, who were kind of brought up Christian in the broadest sort of cultural sense of that word, were now exploring other spiritual paths and didn't describe themselves as Christian anymore. The other one was a survey that said amongst that Gen Z demographic, Gen Z are much less likely to be atheists than their parents were. There's a sort of shift in that. And you put those two things together, and it says to me that there's a whole generation of people who are kind of they're kind of on that spiritual search. They're into trying to find some kind of spiritual sense of meaning and purpose and what that is. And for that particular generation, for many of them, they were not finding it in Christianity or in sort of formal traditional Christianity, but were looking for something beyond that. And I suppose that's what I sort of sense within this, what the Quiet Revival stuff is tapping into. A kind of spiritual hunger in the culture, a spiritual desire and yearning and longing, which is kind of part of what we're made for. And we'll come on to why I think it is happening right now. And so we're talking about a real kind of opportunity for the church at that moment, because there is this hunger. And some of those people are finding their way back into church. And we've begun to experience that in some of the churches that you're part of here. And so I see it as a broader kind of spiritual hunger within the culture, some of which is finding its way back into church. And we long for more of that to happen. So that's, I think, where we are.
Nice, great. Justin, some may say you had a hunch.
Well, I wrote a book that got published about 2 years ago called The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, and followed it up with a podcast series. And yeah, in summary, my case was that we've moved out of the sort of new atheist era in our culture, where basically religion was seen as unscientific and bad for you, into a very different conversation about faith. And lots of public intellectuals, we can talk a bit more about this later, kind of being a lot more sympathetic about the value of Christian faith and that kind of thing. So I published this book, and I called it The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. And inevitably, when that title and cover went out on social media, I had a lot of people, a lot of critics saying, well, all you've got are a few anecdotes here, Justin, some interesting stories, but look at the data. It's all on this landslide of going towards irreligiosity, people stopping going to church. The secularization thesis, basically, is kind of unstoppable. And so it was so interesting and made me sit bolt upright when I suddenly got given notice of this Quiet Revival research. So this was published just before Easter this year. And yeah, these quite surprising statistics that, yes, I mean, for instance, among specifically 18 to 24-year-olds, from a base of about 4% saying they went to church regularly in 2018, to now, to when they polled exactly the same questions last year, that had leapt up to 16%, so effectively had quadrupled. Even more so among young men, interestingly. It was saying 21%, 5 times as many. Now, I was almost like, that's actually quite hard to believe, because if you look, I was hearing a lot of anecdotal stories about young men especially turning up in churches, taking a new interest in faith. But those statistics were like, whoa, that's more than I was expecting. But then at the same time, I had heard other pieces of data. So it was one more piece of the puzzle that I sensed was falling into place. So a year previous to that, I'd heard some very surprising data coming out of Finland, showing a big upswing in the number of young men, again, going to church. Likewise, I was starting to hear about other parts of Europe where apparently young people were starting to take a renewed interest in faith. So, and like you, Graham, I'd heard, these polls about Gen Z being far more open to spirituality, far less likely to be atheists than their parents or grandparents. So in a sense, it made sense in the light of all that. but I was still quite surprised at the magnitude of what was being described. And now I'm sort of really interested in just tracing what that looks like. There are obviously some critiques now of the research and that sort of thing. So I think it's a really interesting moment when we're sort of trying to work out, well, what is the data telling us?
Shall we touch upon that? Because it probably is important to say that A, the research has had pushback against it, and B, Bible Society are boldly but humbly pushing back against the pushback. So both of those things are important to acknowledge. And Justin, is there a sense that people who are sort of saying this data cannot be true for reason A, B, and C, do they doth protest too much?
Well, inevitably, any survey, any poll is in a sense a snapshot that has its own sort of pros and cons about the way it's going to be done. And so I'm not in a position to say what the best type of polling is and what it isn't. Some of the critiques I've seen, inevitably, I think, have come from more secular sources. So the British Humanist Association came out recently to say they think the Bible Society should withdraw this research because they disagree with the way the data was being done and everything. I mean, what's interesting is YouGov is generally seen, and the Bible Society will say, as a very reliable, trusted source. It's a huge sample size that they take. About 13,000 people responded, and that's, in terms of most sort of statistical analyses, that's a very large sample size. Now, the critics are kind of questioning, well, the way in which it's a sort of opt-in survey and so on, does that produce good results, essentially? And I think the proof will be in the pudding. If we start seeing other similar-ish surveys start to produce similar kinds of results, then we'll say, okay, it looks like there is a trend. It may be that it gets, nuanced as we go. My only concern, though, with the critics is YouGov is a widely used surveying mechanism, highly trusted, and even the British humanists themselves have used it frequently for surveying things like attitudes around assisted dying, which arguably are far more sort of immediately things that have an impact on culture. And if they're willing to use it for their own purposes, I think they kind of have to say, well, maybe this other survey that came out of it should be looked at seriously as well.
Yeah, they doth protest too
Well,
much.
maybe, I don't know.
Big surprise, wasn't it, that the humanists had a bit of a problem with it?
Yeah, I'd be worried if they didn't. Graham, before we move on from this section, can I just ask you about the language? Quiet revival, so we're using this word revival. What do you think of the fact that what's happening right now is being labelled a quiet revival? What do you think about the language around it?
I mean, revivals are something. I mean, it seems to me that one of the things about a move of God is that often it's something you can only really tell in retrospect. Sometimes you kind of know that in your own personal life. You look back on something and you think, yeah, that was God. And there's sometimes you look back at something that might have seemed like God at the time, but it wasn't. And so there's an element of which we will kind of only know in the future. But that isn't to say we don't rejoice in it and we don't kind of lean into it and we don't kind of work out, we'll talk about that a little bit later on, what the church does with it. So we may be in the beginnings of the stirring of a revival, a renewal of faith. And there's a question about, have we seen the same things that we've seen in previous revivals in the past? We don't know yet. We've seen beginnings of that. So maybe we're at the beginnings of revival. I think that's where I'd put it at the moment.
It might be helpful to zoom out a bit from this specific piece of research, which is obviously very exciting, but to ask sort of what's the context for this? Graham, you've done a lot of looking back at the past century to look at what kind of things have been happening in our culture that might have produced a moment like this. I wondered if you could talk about that a bit.
Yeah. I mean, it seems to me one of the reasons why it may be happening now is because I think we are in a kind of cultural moment where a lot of the secular narratives have basically failed. If you look over the last century, there's a sense in which kind of cultural movements have about a 40-year span. So from around sort of 1910 to about 1950, one of the big sort of movements and kind of political, spiritual movements was fascism. That seemed to be, it captured a lot of people's imaginations. Of course, it came, the real character of that was revealed at the end of the Second World War, where we realized what happens with fascist dictatorships like that. That collapsed at the end of the Second World War. Then you had, from about 1950 to 1940, communism was something that it captured people's minds and hearts with the kind of growth of communism in the Soviet Union, in China, and to a certain extent here as well. But then again in 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell, There was a sense of that was a bit of a busted flush. That wasn't going to go any further either. There was that fascinating moment in 1989. Some of you might remember a man called Francis Fukuyama, who was a kind of Japanese-American academic who wrote an article in a book called The End of History. And his point was not that, history's now done, there's nothing's going to happen. But his point was that now that, fascism and communism have been shown to be empty promises, there's only one game in town, and that game is secular, Western, liberal democracy. And that's the only thing that's going to win the day from here on. Now, we look back on that, 35 or so years later, and we actually realize that all those things haven't sort of delivered anything. So, the future is secular. Well, the Twin Towers, those planes crashing into it, made people realize that, for better or worse, religion was still a powerful motivation for people in our world. The growth of Christianity in China, in Africa, shows that religion has a powerful effect on people. The future is Western. Well, again, it felt like that in 1989. People sometimes say the 19th century was the British century, the 20th century was the American century, the 21st century is the Chinese century. Now, the real growth of sort of the economy and culture is really looking east towards Asia now. The future is not necessarily Western. Democracy, Western liberal democracy. Well, 2016, Brexit, Donald Trump, that kind of raised questions about all that. And so the promise of technology, and I think increasingly we're kind of realizing that technology is not actually going to deliver everything we want. What it's led to is climate change. It's led to the kind of fear of what AI might produce. And so all those secular narratives that fascism, communism, liberal democracy, technology, they're going to save us. Nobody believes that anymore. And so there's a kind of absence, a spiritual hunger, a gap at the heart of our culture. And I think a lot of people are beginning to look around and think, well, what is there? And kind of Christianity hasn't gone away. It's still there. And that's why people are beginning to look into Christianity as a source of spiritual, cultural renewal, which I think is quite remarkable.
That's really, really helpful. Big picture way of looking at it. What are you seeing kind of, I suppose, that's been happening in the last, I guess, couple of decades, Belle, that for you is bubbling this up potentially is part of the reason for why we're seeing this renewed spiritual hunger?
Yeah, I guess I have two answers to that, because my primary answer, as much as I love to truly geek out over the cultural landscape and be like, okay, X and Y equals that or whatever, I don't know, I just think we were made for this, really. I think I quote all the time, like literally all the time. I've just finished a draft of a book, and it is the first line in my book, and it is the last line in my book. It's St. Augustine. You have made us, O Lord, for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they find their rest in you. Like, if I was to kind of define this cultural moment, it would be restlessness. I think what we've done over the past couple of decades is we've done really, really well at pretending we're not restless, or like channeling it in different places. And every single place we challenge it crumbles before our eyes, just as Graham has said. And so I see just like this restlessness is so close to the surface on people that I'm speaking to. Like so close to the surface. And this is the exciting thing, right? I had a journalist call me maybe like 18 months ago. She was working for Sky. So, it's not a Christian media outlet. And she called me, and I had never met this lady before ever. And her one question was like, what on earth is going on with Christianity at the moment? Like, I think she must have just like searched Christian on LinkedIn and my face popped up. So she came to me.
You are the Christian.
I am the Christian. And so she called me and she was like, what on earth is happening with Christianity at the moment? And I started going through all of these like cultural things. I was like, oh, I know. You must be talking about like Stormzy on the Pyramid Stage in 2019, or you must be talking about Ayaan Hirsi Ali's like U-turn, or you must be talking about Martin Short, like all of these cultural things. And she kind of shut me up, and she was like, yeah. No, I'm not talking about that, actually. She said, like, actually, I was wondering, because what's happening is my friends who have been atheists for my whole life are going to church, and my family. And then we kind of started talking about that, and I was like, oh, sorry. I can't believe my eyes were so focused on the limelight that I haven't been paying attention. And then as she sort of started to trust me more, she was like, oh, can I be honest with you? The reason I called you is because I keep going to church and I keep wanting to pray. What's happening to me? And so I think what the beautiful thing is, the thing that I'm struck by, and since then I really was like, oh, Lord, I'm so sorry. I have not been paying attention to what you're doing on the ground. I was like, show me what you're doing. And since then, I have had conversations with people on the streets. I have had messages from people I was in school with. I went to a wedding once where I had to preach. And I was really super nervous because I'm actually not very good at talking about Jesus to people who aren't Christians. My job is actually hilarious. And so I was so nervous. And yet I spoke about Jesus more that day than anything else. The next day I woke up to a DM from the photographer asking about Jesus. Like, it's not like they've been waiting for cultural clues that Christianity is the in thing again. I think some people have, sure. I think Tom Holland makes a difference. I think people like Jordan Peterson make a difference. I do think they do. But there's this whole other subset of people that just feel this restlessness. And that's probably down to the dating crisis and the loneliness crisis and the climate crisis and the housing crisis and just this like, oh my goodness, everything that gave us rest is crumbling, and we realize that we were made for more. So it's this interesting thing of this feeling like moreness, and that is doing an interesting thing to our culture.
That's really helpful. I appreciate everything you said there, because Graham is sketching out the big picture of changes that have occurred over the last several decades, century, and you talking about that restlessness that's always been there, but I think it bubbles up at certain moments. And there's a sense in which we've reached a sort of crunch point. I get the sense that people have realized the more science and technology and money and prosperity we put in, it turns out it doesn't actually make us happier. There's a kind of a point at which you realize we tend to, the more that we try to save ourselves with these things, the more we realize we're in need of a savior. And my sense has been the openness that there is to Christian faith, to spirituality, is coming from that sense of almost a desperation. We've tried everything else, and it's not working, and that's why this person you spoke to, I think, maybe is trying church. And I've run into lots of people who are trying church. They don't necessarily believe, but the term that I'm often finding they're using of themselves is the term, oh, I'm a lapsed atheist. A lapsed atheist. So I'm not a Christian, but I'm not an atheist either. I don't, Giles Corran, who's a Sunday Times columnist, used this phrase of himself recently when he kind of came out as one of these people, well, I'm going to church, having never really been to church before, or it was sort of part of his sort of chapel-going education when he grew up, but he was always an atheist. And then suddenly, just because his young son said, Dad, I'd like us to go to church, he said, well, let's give it a try. They went down to their local church, and he's been going ever since. And he says in this article, I do not believe. So he's not saying, I'm all in, I'm a Christian, but he's saying, I want to believe. It's sort of, it's there. And for me, again, coming back to the bigger picture, I think it's part of a sort of meaning crisis. That's what the phrase a lot of psychologists have been using for the age we're living in. We don't have a story that makes sense of our lives anymore. And I think people are just looking for a better story of life. And all the stories we're being offered through technology, politics, all the different ideologies that are on offer, they're all stories that can't fulfill that hole, that restlessness that's actually there.
And there is something about moments of civilizational change where there is a kind of opportunity for the church to somehow step in, and God seems to do something remarkable. You think back, the end of the with the fall of the Roman Empire in the kind of end of the 4th, 5th centuries, that was the time which, Augustine comes along and speaks into that with this powerful kind of vision of Christian, the Christian faith, not a sort of Christian civilization. That's not what he had in mind, but that's kind of what came out of that. You think of the 17th century, 16th century, a time when printing, this new technology has suddenly kind of appeared in the world, and the Reformation happens, and a kind of renewal and revival of faith. Think of the 18th century, the time of the Enlightenment. It's exactly at that period when John Wesley and George Whitefield and others begin, through them, somehow the kind of evangelical revival happens. These are moments of great civilizational shifts, and those often seem to be moments when God does something within the church. Now, that means that if we are in a civilizational shift moment, which I think a lot of commentators would say we are right now, with all the changes that are going on in our world, it won't be a matter of going back to something. We're not kind of going back to Christendom. We're not going back to the 1950s. It's not nostalgia. It's not, I don't know, if only we could get our power back as a church. But something new may be birthed out of this. And that's the really interesting and fascinating, exciting time in which we live.
I think it's really important as well for us to take this beautiful data from the Bible Society and declare it as a story of opportunity, not victory. Like, it is an opportunity for us right now, and we have to zoom out and wonder, like, okay, well, what is happening culturally so that we can seize this opportunity, so that we can see what God is doing, what's rumbling, what's melting away, and we can see it through the eyes of Jesus. And so what's really interesting is, this is why I love sort of this trio, is we all have our eyes in slightly different directions, watching what God is doing to the left or the right, or, in the rural places and in the cities. And so the people that I've really got my eye on, the people that I do a lot of my work for and with, are people who are doing all kinds of spiritual practices. They are all making their way into the mainstream. So manifesting, tarot card reading, buying crystals, Reiki healing, all of that is also seeing a major increase. So this restlessness, again, is driving people to do this. And what's really interesting is what may have been wellness brands, they're like, oh my goodness, people have come to the end of self-help. They're going spiritual. Maybe we should too. And they are. You can buy spiritual practices anywhere. And all of that is so fascinating. And so in a way, in our culture, we're almost like a phrase that we use. It's we're so post-Christian now, we're pre-Christian again. We're porous to it again. Biblical literacy is pretty low at the moment among Gen Z in particular, and we can see that as a sad thing, or we could see that as an opportunity, the likes of which we haven't had in decades. And that takes creativity, but that excites me, because our culture as it is at the moment, with this smorgasbord of spiritual options that anyone can kind of pick from, that's very first century. That's very early church. That's the exact culture in which the early church learnt to speak about and declare Jesus. This is Paul in Athens kind of stuff. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
This is, so the idea that we are becoming a re-enchanted world again, that disenchantment is finally a facade we've stopped giving much time to, that is an opportunity story, I think.
I mean, what's interesting to me, though, is that I think there's a bit of a shift, because in a sense, the New Age and so on, it's been around since the 60s, when everyone started going to the East and seeking enlightenment and everything. But since that time, a lot of people have talked about being spiritual but not religious. So essentially, I'm open to things, but don't give me institutional forms of church and Christianity. And the phrase I'm hearing more and more flips it and says, well, I'm actually more religious but not spiritual, as in people who are looking for the structure, looking for something that brings it together. Religion literally means, religio is about binding things together. And I think because we have lived for so long in a very postmodern culture where it's you do you, as long as you're not hurting anyone, make up your own sort of adventure, I think that's quite difficult to sustain in the long run. And in a funny way, the reason I think a lot of young people are taking an interest specifically in Christian faith and church is because it does offer a sort of structure. It offers a kind of stability, the kind of smorgasbord, just do pick your own religion and I'll have a bit of the tarot cards and a bit of that. But it doesn't really offer a community, a place, a rule of life, something that you can kind of get your teeth stuck into. And I think people are kind of craving that again in a funny way. And so I heard Nick Cave, who's quite a well-known musician, who's kind of been on his own sort of surprising rebirth journey, talking about, the way in which he's been coming back to church and surprised to find himself really longing for the kind of, the more systematic structures of going somewhere, praying, being with people. And he said, I'm looking for the religion now, not just the spirituality. Spirituality's been around all the time in the arts and everything, but I'm looking for something a bit more challenging in that sense.
Yeah, it's a bit like learning a language, isn't it? In the sense that when the kind of smorgasbord approach to the sort of new agey, bit of this, bit of that, and so on. It's a bit like saying, okay, I'm going to I quite like Portuguese verbs, and I like Latin nouns, and I like sort of English adjectives. I'm going to put them all together, and that never really works. You've got to kind of commit yourself to a language, English or Spanish or French or whatever, and you learn that discipline. And I think that's what a lot of people are kind of recognizing. But I'd love to move the conversation on a little bit to, in our last 15 minutes before we open it up to questions, on how you think, I mean, if, Belle, you were saying how we are perhaps at a moment, not of victory, but of opportunity. And I guess one of the mistakes we might make is think, oh, great, we're winning now. Or even we won because the tide is turning and we can just relax and so on. But if we are in a moment of opportunity where there's an openness to faith, there's an openness to spirituality, there's the beginnings of stirring of something, how does the church respond at that moment? How should we respond to this this quiet revival or whatever it is that's happening? And I mean, just to spark the conversation a little bit, it strikes me again, thinking back over previous times of church renewal and so on. It seems to me that always what's happened in those is not that Christians have gone about saying, okay, we're going to change the culture. We're going to create a new Christian civilization. I was reading something recently where someone said about the early church that they were passionate about Jesus and they changed the world by accident. It wasn't that they went about thinking, okay, we're going to change the world. We're going to have a political campaign. We're going to lobby government. We're going to make things different. We're going to kind of bring about the kingdom of God on earth. No, they were passionate about Jesus, worshiping Jesus, praying, offering their worship and living that distinctive Christian life. And kind of almost as a secondary thing, Christendom emerged and the world changed. And so that seems to be one of the things we maybe need to do, is to focus on Jesus rather than somehow cultural influence. But I'd love your thoughts on how you think the church should respond to this particular moment. Belle.
Oh, I have so many directions I could go in. Where shall I go first? I'm going to start, because maybe we'll bounce it around a little bit. I am going to start with something that I advocate for so annoyingly regularly, which is a posture of generous curiosity, I think. So, for example, again, this might be because this is where I look, where I am. Someone who has come to Christianity by way of like 4 different spiritualities. Do you know, like they've tried A, B, C, and D. They've like taken their pick on the smorgasbord, and now Christianity is the one that they're trying. I would always advocate for a generous curiosity, because if, as I keep quoting, as we keep saying, God has made us for himself and our hearts are restless until they find their rest in him, then to be curious enough to see the person before us as a restless heart who has been desperately seeking rest here, there, and everywhere. And so, for example, when I have spoken to someone who's gone to a tarot card reader and I've been like, tell me why, like, tell me the craving, what was promised to you there, and what like pulled you into that room. And they start to tell me like why, what it was. It was this idea that they just needed someone to cut through the noise of their own brain. They needed like a knowing voice to come and guide them. They needed someone to speak with knowledge that they couldn't have got in like a so-called logical way. And as I listen to them talk, I'm like, oh, well, I believe in the prophetic. And I see you were made by God for him, and your heart is restless because you're trying to find your rest in him. Like, I see the actual, the true, the deep, and the innate craving that is within you. I actually think you were designed with that. I think that's like one of the truest things about you. But if we're not curious enough to someone, or we're not generous, then it's really hard to draw the line from A to B. It's really hard to say, oh, I fully get that. Do you know where I go when I'm feeling needy, like I'm desperate for some guidance, like I'm desperate for someone to speak into my circumstances with knowledge that is like beyond them? I go to the church and I ask someone to pray for me and to listen to God for me and then to speak into my life. So I just think that posture of generous curiosity towards those who are going to come in is essential, because like we say, this is a time of opportunity, not victory. There's like a fragility to it, you know. We've all chatted to Rhiannon, who's one of the authors of this piece of research, and she said there's no guarantee that in 5 years' time the data will be the same. The church must respond. Yeah, I'll start there.
I agree with all of that. And what I like about what you're saying there, Belle, is there's an opportunity essentially to have open-ended conversations with people, and just as you had with the Sky News reporter. And that, I think, is what we're witnessing. It's an openness. Now, it's not a done deal, okay, and those conversations can go in different directions. But what I do see is that people are looking to have a conversation. So this is the time, I think, for the church and for Christians to talk. And perhaps we've sort of been on the back foot, 20 years ago when it felt like everyone was dismissing religion and talking about how terrible it was. Well, now I think there's an open door to having really good conversations with people. And so I would say this is the opportunity to be bold, not in a kind of, antagonistic or dismissive way, but to sort of listen, but also tell our story more confidently, because I think people are ready to hear the story again. So I would say that's one simple thing you can do. And the research is telling us, if you invite someone to church, they're way more likely to say yes now. 1 in 3 people will likely say yes if you invited them tomorrow to your church. So there's a lot of people out there, it turns out, who are open to talking about faith and to even stepping inside a church building. So that's one very simple way we can respond. We can just talk to them and say, would you like to come along with me?
Reminds me, I was in China a number of years ago and meeting with a church pastor there, and saying to him, I always wanted to ask this question, because in the West we've just seen decline in the church for the last couple of 100 years, and you here in China, you've seen this extraordinary growth since the Cultural Revolution. So I said, well, what's the secret? And he said, well, it's very simple, really. There's the first thing is that every Chinese Christian knows it's their responsibility to talk to their family and friends about Jesus. I thought, well, that's quite interesting. I'm not sure every Christian in the UK thinks that. And I said, well, how do they do it? Do they sort of learn some technique? Do they kind of have some course that they invite them on, or what does it work? And he said, no, they just ask them to come to church. And sometimes they say no, and that's fine. But if they come, somehow they meet Jesus. And struck me how incredibly simple that is, that there's something about inviting someone to church, and whether it's in the sermon or in a words of a worship song or in the reading or a Holy Communion, whatever it might be, there's the chance that someone might encounter Jesus. It's the simplest possible way to do it.
I think with that then is the question, what will they find when they walk into church, of course? And that's really where the church, I think, can make a difference and have that kind of open posture that you're talking about, Belle, because my worry is a lot of the church has been taken by surprise by this fact that people are interested in it again. And we've kind of got into a very navel-gazing kind of posture where a lot of internal politics and other things have kind of taken our eye off the ball, that, the fields are white unto harvest, that there's something out there. And so my hope is that this reminder that it turns out something's happening in the culture, and there's the breath of God is blowing through, and it's going to wake us up as a church to say, let's be ready. Let's be ready for the people who are looking for meaning and looking for a better story, who may be just about to come through the doors. Now, one thing I would add to this is one of the most interesting things that came out of a lot of interviews I did in starting to research this surprising rebirth of belief in God, talking to a lot of these secular intellectuals who were somewhere on the fringes of faith, maybe dipping their toe into church, very aware of the cultural value of Christianity, but not quite sure if Christianity is actually true. One of the things they've said to me time and again is, keep Christianity weird. Now, is something we're very prone to not doing. We want to sort of make everything super accessible, everything sort of kind of the seeker-friendly movement, if you like, sort of in many ways tried to say, let's try and make Christianity as reasonable and rational and tick all the boxes for kind of being able to just walk in. Now, I'm not saying we put up artificial barriers, but actually, one of the things that actually is attracting people to church is that it's very different, actually. It's very different to the culture that we find around us. And part of that is the weirdness of it. And so when you look, interestingly, at the Quiet Revival research, the 2 areas that it says that are seeing the most growth in the church are the very sort of high church, Anglo-Catholic stuff, because that's kind of got the weirdness of the ritual and the liturgy and the kind of being brought into an almost drama on a Sunday that takes you out of your normal everyday. So when I speak to someone like the historian Tom Holland, he goes to that kind of a church because he says, I love that. I love that it's different. It's not just a sort of warmed over version of what I can already find in the culture. It takes me, it transports me somewhere else. But the other part of the church, which arguably I think even more is seeing the benefit of this quiet revival, is the charismatic and Pentecostal end of the church. And again, that's a weirdness of a different kind, but an important kind, which is the openness to the supernatural, that God does speak, that there is prophecy. And I think there's an openness. People are looking for something other than the secular, scientific, materialistic world. And this is the moment for us to be comfortable in our own skin and say, this is who we are. Come and join us. You might just find that God wants to speak to you as well.
Yeah. Keep it big and keep it weird. Yeah. I would just say just one more thing, and then we'll open it up to questions as well. I'm really, really struck by, and you guys might have been struck by it too, it can't have evaded our notice that this is happening at the same time, that this data is coming out in the same sort of cluster of months that our UK government are arguably pushing through some of the most anti-Christian legislation we've seen in ages. Now, I don't think that's a coincidence, but also I wonder, will we notice what God is doing if the church looks like it's gaining strength but losing power at the same time? Do you know what I mean? Like if we're gaining strength but losing political power, and now hear me, like we pray for our government, we pray for policy, we pray for legislation, we work in our local government, we work in our towns and our cities, and we want to see renewal, and we want to see Jesus, like, we want to do what the early church did, right? We want to live so captivated by Jesus that things get turned right side up from the top, from right grassroots upwards, right? That we would catch people's eye, that we would be just the right amount of annoying and stubborn and attractive and different, and like our lives make no sense if Jesus isn't real and true, and then that changes policy. But both historically and geographically, the church thrives in contexts that are not Christian. There is a seminar going on right now called What We Could Learn from the Persecuted Church. That is where the fastest growing church is. It's in the countries where it is illegal to be so. Now, of course, I would never pray that in, never ever. Like, I've been to those countries, I've visited them, like the stories still wear through my mind. It's not that we desire that, and I need to make that really clear, but would we feel comfortable if the church gained strength at the exact same time that it seemed to be losing power? Would we know what to do with that? Would we still see that as a move of God? That at the same time our country seems to be becoming in so many ways less quote-unquote Christian, in the very Tom Holland kind of, he's so helpful on that. And yet more and more people are finding themselves in church. So I think there is and you've kind of touched upon it as well, there's a danger in nostalgia with this. There's a danger in us thinking, great, we're going back to the 50s, like we ruled the roost and our story was the winning story. And, and of course there's a beauty in that, but I just don't think that that's what's going to happen. So if God did something radically new and radically uncomfortable, is that okay with us? I guess is my thought.
Yeah, and that I think speaks into something else, a kind of other posture I think we need. I think, you've really helpfully talked about a kind of a sort of posture of generous curiosity. We talked about a kind of maybe a humility towards what's going on. In that if this is a quiet revival, it's not been planned. Church of England head office didn't sit down and plan this thing, much as though we'd like to have done. No one planned it. This is if it's true, it's God. But I think one of the other postures I think we probably need as a church is to be kind of culturally literate as a church. It strikes me again, those moments of revival and renewal were times when the church had something to say to the culture that absolutely met what that culture was longing for at that moment. You think back again, 17th, 18th century, the kind of evangelical revival. It was the time of the Enlightenment, where people were kind of looking for certainty. You had philosophers like Descartes saying, well, we can be certain, but because of our reason will tell us what is certain. And John Wesley and George Whitefield were coming and say, well, you don't get certainty from your mind. What will give you certainty is this experience of the presence of God, of faith in God, that brings you a faith in the God of Jesus Christ, that brings you a certainty of heart and soul, that God is real, and so on. So, you could multiply examples of that. And so I think one of the things we need to be able to do is to kind of read culture really wisely. It's one of the things we try to do on obviously Re-Enchanting, we're trying to do that on seenandunseen.com, which is the website that we run from Center for Cultural Witness. There may be a slide that tells us something about it. But again, it's trying to read the culture and, through Christian eyes and trying to see, where do we see those signs of God's presence, those signs of God's absence, those places where God is somehow surprisingly seen. I was reading a Sally Rooney novel a little while ago, and she came up with one of the best definitions of God I've come across recently. She said, maybe people do kind of believe in God because he is that deep principle of love and goodness that underlies everything. Goodness that doesn't matter whether it's seen or whether it's understood, but it's there. And I thought, that's pretty good. There's something of God showing up in that moment. But there are other moments in culture where you sort of really feel the absence, the pain of a culture that has pushed God to the edges. And it's being able to spot those moments and speak of them in conversation. Put them on your social media, whatever else it might be. Read the culture wisely. Be those kind of critical readers of culture. Just as the great theologian Karl Barth says, always have the Bible in one hand, newspaper in the other. See how you read the newspaper through the lens of the Bible, and that's what we need to learn to do.
Yes.
Great.
That's so good. Okay. We promised Q&A. We will deliver Q&A. All right. So if you have a question, if you could make your way to our left, there is a wonderful gentleman who's going to wave so that everyone knows where he is. There you go. And if you could keep your questions brief, we will try and keep our answers brief. And that means hopefully we can get through a really good number.
Just wondered if any members of the panel have any thoughts about what Blaise Pascal would like to say on the Quiet Revival.
That question must be directed at me. So,
Yeah, thank you, Pete. Well, if you don't know, Blaise Pascal, 17th century genius of all kinds, fascinating man, entrepreneur, scientist, philosopher, Christian. I've just written a biography of him, which is why I'm interested in him. It's called Blaise Pascal, the man who made the modern world. I think he's someone who speaks absolutely into our times, because he's sort of in between two strands of thinking, and the kind of rationalist strand of Descartes and the kind of skeptical strand of this guy Montaigne in the previous century before. It's absolutely, Dawkins on the one side, we can understand the world by reason. The kind of postmodern skeptics, there's no such thing as truth, there's nothing you can rely on. And he's steering a kind of Christian wisdom between that. Which speaks absolutely powerfully into our age. He speaks into a world of distraction. What are the distractions that take us away from asking the big questions of life? He has this powerful, extraordinary experience of God in his sort of late, early 30s, and it just transforms his life. So if you want to, it's a fascinating story, fascinating man. I think he speaks absolutely into our time. So thanks for the sales pitch, Pete.
As someone who is a member of Gen Z and really been seeing this revival within school particularly, I was not very surprised when I saw the Quiet Revival data, because I think all around, from all my friends that are Christian and going to school, they're seeing so many people come to Jesus. It's just been so amazing. My question really is, what would you say to those of us who are still attending school and seeing people come to faith, and what would you say would be the best kind of next move for us?
Gosh, I'll start and then go to you, Belle.
Yeah,
so I have Gen Z teenagers myself, and your experience is to some extent reflected in their experience as well. I remember when I was a teenager, a very long time ago now, but I definitely felt far more like it was weird and kind of difficult to talk about faith with my peers. They don't seem to have that same experience as Christians themselves. They are seeing a kind of an openness among their peer group, just getting on WhatsApp and doing like Bible studies with each other and stuff like that. And I see it reflected again in the media they consume on TikTok and Instagram Reels. There's just a lot of really out there Gen Z Christian influencers that they can share and talk about. And there's a kind of a new openness to that. And so I would just say for your school and what you're seeing happen there, brilliant, wonderful, praise God. Just keep doing what you're doing, I would say, being who you are, being open about your faith. And I think the important thing is to kind of just be alongside those people as they're going on that journey and invite them to take that next step. It might be something like an alpha course. It might be something like come along to my church. It might be the challenge of taking a step towards baptism or whatever it might be. But that's just so encouraging to hear, because I think we sometimes in the cultural conversations lose sight that there's just a hunger on the ground, and it's absolutely brilliant to hear about.
Yeah. I've once been called a geriatric Gen Z, which I'll take. I'm right there on the cusp. I'm one of you, okay? I would just say, just really briefly, we talk a lot about this idea of we sometimes feel like we need to be advocates for God, in which case we will only show people our most polished selves. And that tendency kicks in with me specifically when people seem curious about Jesus. I think like, right, then my best side has to come out, the side of me that's most peaceful and joy-filled and gracious and knows everything. And instead of being advocates for God, we are love letters from him to the people that we live our lives with. So I think I've more got an anti piece of advice. I think the worst thing that you or any of us could do at this moment is pretend to be anything other than who we are, broken and flawed and deeply captivated by the love of Jesus. I think for us to pretend to be anything else is one of the worst things we could do for all of us. But the most, you are right there on the front lines, right there in the harvest. It's so exciting. So I think that's what I would say. Thank you so much.
Hi. For someone who's interested in finding out more about Jesus but not yet ready to come to church, what book, podcast, or testimony specifically would you recommend to them?
Gosh.
You mean apart from the Re-Enchanting podcast, don't you?
Graham, what would you recommend to the person just on the journey, looking to step in but not quite sure?
Yeah, it depends what you're looking for, really. I mean, obviously, Tom Holland's Dominion is a fascinating account of the impact of Christian faith upon our culture. It makes you realize how much, so much of what we take for granted is kind of Christian in origin. It's a good sort of historical place to start. I've written a little book called Why Being Yourself is a Bad Idea. Which is trying to, he was trying to sort of think of I was thinking my kids' friends and who were in a similar sort of position, who are interested in sort of spirituality, but they're not ready to go to church. And I was thinking, how would I explain Christian faith to them? And I sort of started with this idea of, the number one command of modern life is be yourself. But that's actually quite a confusing bit of advice. What does it really mean to be yourself? And it's sort of an exploration of Christian faith from that angle. So that may be something you'd pick up. You guys are probably better engaged in the podcast world than I am, but yeah.
There is this one called The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, but generally, I've tried to actually aim it at precisely the person you're talking about there, because it's trying to do a deep dive into all of these kinds of changes we've been talking about. But very specifically, yes, I think it's helpful for the Christian listener, but it doesn't presume a faith on the part of the listener. And so sometimes I've had a lot of people who are in that place of saying, I'm interested, but I don't yet believe, but I'm kind of on the cusp, who have got in touch with me and said, it really helped to kind of give me a bigger picture of what's going on. Because I think a lot of people just get bits and pieces of information, and they've heard this about church and they know that about the culture. I've tried to paint a bit of a picture of where we are and why the Christian story does speak so powerfully to some of the issues that we're going through at the moment. So if that's not too self-publicity.
And you could try seenandunseen.com. That is a kind of trying to look at our culture through the lens of Christian faith and what difference does Christian faith make to the way you see the world.
And other than that, go back to some classics. I mean, I just think C.S. Lewis is such a good read in every age and seems to somehow continue to speak to people today. So I was talking to someone in that very position who's just been reading C.S. Lewis and said, it's amazing that the stuff he wrote 80 years ago, it just seems so pertinent to today. That depends on the person, but that might be another direction to go in.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Hi, panel. I just want to come back to your cultural reflections that I thought were really, really interesting. And in particular, sort of, I think it resonated certainly with me, the notion of the sort of postmodern, the disappointment with the postmodern liberalism, which has almost become a sort of moral and cultural relativism, right? However, what I'm not hearing a lot of people talking about, and I'd love you to speak to, is certainly if we look at the States and the sort of Christian nationalism that emerges out of the sort of far right from the States, to use that term, do you feel like there's any danger or potential that the shift that we're seeing in terms of people engaging or re-engaging with the institution of church might also be reflective of a sort of pull to the far right happening? I note that sort of your Reform Party, Stephen Yaxley Lennon or Tommy Robinson, and people like Rupert Lowe, sort of, they're using this sort of cultural Christianity to otherize and to say, well, we are a Christian nation, and therefore this group and that group, necessarily don't belong or whatever, in order to validate their own politics. So do you feel like there's any danger that this is also a reflection of perhaps a more insidious movement to the right?
I mean, if I can pick that one up first, I think you've hit the nail on the head. There is an absolute danger of that. And there is this quote-unquote cultural Christianity, and even people like Richard Dawkins have described themselves, the arch-atheist, as a cultural Christian. Now, if Richard Dawkins can go about describing himself as a cultural Christian, you've got to ask, well, what is this phrase? And there's a very good discussion, actually, on the Re-Enchanting podcast in this whole area that Belle oversaw at the Bradford Literary Festival recently, and I think they nailed some of those issues there. For me, something that's really important to recognize, as Graham hinted earlier, is that whatever culture Christianity has produced, it was a byproduct, and it was because people were looking at Jesus and following him. The problem is, when you aim at culture and try to kind of eliminate Jesus, you're going to get something very different. You're going to get an idol, basically. And I think the people who are using Christianity as a sort of identity marker in that kind of way, it's not Christianity. It's sub-biblical, it's idolatry, and it is a huge dead end, and a very dangerous dead end. So I'm very, very keenly aware that there is a very significant bad turn that this can take, and there are some people who are motivated to do that. Having said all that, I don't think we should give it up as just, this is just right-wing politics, of the vibe shift in that direction. There's a genuine spiritual hunger here, and there's going to be a lot of mixed motives at play about how people interact with this. I think we just have to be very wise, and this is why Graham is quite right about being really intelligent culture readers, not to fall into those traps. It's very easy, I think, to do that, but not to also dismiss this, because there's a genuine spiritual hunger, and we need to keep our eyes on Jesus and not on some quote-unquote civilizational cultural aim.
Just very quickly, I have just noted, yes, I'm worried about that. Now, this is really interesting, is, again, the people that I'm got my eyes on would be utterly repelled by that, and yet somehow they're still finding Jesus. Somehow they're not being put off. It's grace. But I think that, so the one thing I would say is, what I have noticed is that people are spotting counterfeits everywhere. There has to be a captivation with Jesus, and at the center of it, because people are very, very, naming no names, people are very good at spotting when someone is doing what both you and Justin have just alluded to. And it's very quickly being dismissed. I don't know if you've noticed. And so there's this captivation of Jesus being the absolute bullseye at the heart of everything. Otherwise, people smell it and they will not, But yeah, it's an absolute worry. Thank you so much. We have time for one, do we? Yeah, we'll do one more.
Yeah. We focused a lot on the Generation Z, i.e. a group that perhaps were not really listening to the gospel. But there are lots of other groups that historically perhaps haven't been listening to the gospel, and yet I think more recently different cultures, different backgrounds, immigrants, all sorts of different groups are finding Jesus. And I just wondered whether there's anything you could say into that perhaps brings it out of a single culture, the sorts of things we've just been mentioning there, if that is clear enough.
Do you want to pick that one up, Graham?
Yeah, I think if I understand the question right, I think it's about different cultural groups kind of discovering Christ, and I think there is a real wisdom in that. And something that the church is the one kind of hugely multicultural community that we know. As we sometimes say, water is thicker than blood. In other words, the water of baptism that unites Christians across the world creates a stronger bond than the blood relationships that we have with our families and our ethnicities and so on. And actually, if this thing is true, it's going to be something that goes beyond Gen Z. If this is a genuine kind of revival of faith, it's going to touch all kinds of different communities and nations and ethnicities and groups. And one of the interesting things is that I keep hearing stories from not just different denominations, but different countries, around Europe, all telling the same kind of story, in some parts of the USA as well, and in Australia and elsewhere. So this is something that's not just, and maybe that's part of the globalized culture, that something just doesn't remain local, but it is touching all kinds of different communities. And it's part of the humility that we need to bring to this, is that whatever our particular tradition, background within the Christian faith, to have that openness to learn from and listen to those other parts of the church where this thing may be bubbling up in ways that we haven't necessarily kind of understood so far. And so I think if this is genuine, it's something that's going to touch all kinds of different parts of the church. And rather than sort of owning it and saying this is our thing, and keeping it to ourselves, it's actually, what is God doing in these other places? Having your eyes open to see what is happening in other people groups and other parts of the church as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to finish that, as has been hinted earlier, this was not manufactured by any of us or by the church. If there is something happening, it's God. So let's give it to God. Let's allow God to lead, and let's just follow in a spirit of humble prayerfulness, I think, and ask. I think there's a lot of lessons we can see from history about when the church has had every opportunity and fumbled the ball. This is our opportunity to actually learn from those mistakes and say, God, would you lead us?
Yeah, we could go on and on and on. But Wildfires, thank you so much for hosting us. Please give yourselves a big old round of applause. It has been our joy. And we should sign off season 7 of Re-Enchanting.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone, for listening. If you're listening wherever you are in the world, thank you for listening to season 7. What a wonderful way to cap it off here at Wildfires. God bless you all. God bless.
Wonderful. That was absolute gold. If you enjoyed that, and I'm sure you will, you will want to share it when it comes out. When will that be?
In just about a week and a half.
Week,
Yeah, a week and a half.
10 days' time. The clock is ticking. You'll be able to listen to it, listen to your own whoops, and share it with others. Do check out. It's so good just to think, isn't it? And to have intelligent conversation. And we're so grateful, not just for this context now, but for the way that all 3 of these people have helped us to do that over years. Do get Justin Brierley's new book, Why I Am Still a Christian Even After Wildfires.
I'm just hanging in there after Wildfires.
But it is called Why I'm Still a Christian, isn't it?
That's right, yeah, that's the latest one.
And do Graham's new one, as you might have picked up, Blaise Pascal, the man who made the modern world a romping good read. And Belle, when's yours coming out?
Next year.
Excellent.
Yeah, it's book number 1, everybody.
Do we have a
Book number
title
1.
yet?
We don't have a title, but my name is Belle Tindall, so look for that.
The so far untitled Belle Tindall blockbuster coming out next year. So thanks very much, everybody, and God bless you.